Welcome to Back to the Text Themselves, a series on phenomenology. Today's video examines Chapter 4, Sections 25 to 26 in Heidegger's Being and Time. Acknowledging that you exist may seem a rather trite, uninteresting realization. Of course you exist. You would not even be able to think that thought had you not already existed. So it would seem that the thought is pointless. As an objective statement of fact, that would be correct. However, the acknowledgement that we exist evokes another thought, that it's possible that I not exist, possible that I could have never been born, and especially the inevitable possibility of no longer existing one day. Being aware of this possibility of not existing can have some major ramifications for us. It may move us to act differently, to perhaps live life more fully, to take advantage of the possibilities available to us in this life. So our awareness of this possibility provides grounds for our freedom. However, given the implications of such an awareness, why is it that most of the time we don't consider such a possibility? What redirects our awareness away from the possibility of non-existence? We begin to find an answer to this question in Chapter 4 as we consider a particular and primordial mode of Dasein's being in the world, which is our being with others. And it's in our being with others that most often answers the question, who is Dasein? So today we take up this existential determination of Dasein, which will, in the following video, allow us to consider how this being with manifests in our average everydayness in the mode of inauthenticity, and how that mode distracts us from considering the possibility of no longer existing. So in this video, I address the following questions. 1. How is being with an existential determination of Dasein? 2. How does the concept of being with avoid the epistemological problem of other minds? And 3. How does Dasein care for others? This channel addresses works of philosophy and psychoanalysis. Each video, structured by several questions, analyzes a small section as we gradually move through an entire text. To support this work, please consider liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. You can also support this work on Patreon. Link is below in the description. We begin by addressing the question, who is Dasein? How do we arrive at an answer to such a question? Or to phrase it in terms Heidegger puts it, how is the I of Dasein given to itself? The notion of givenness is important for phenomenology and forms one of the central concepts of Husserl's thought. Gegebenheit or givenness is not equivalent to an empirical given, such as one finds articulated in Seller's essay on the myth of the given. Rather, it characterizes the fact that there is something that comes to appear or arrives in experience that is not equivalent to the mental act that grasps it. So, for example, in perception, there is that which is perceived. In imagination, that which is imagined. In judgment, that which is judged. It's a manner by which we undergo something that may arrive in intuition, though not necessarily. The givenness of something occurs in various modes by which the given, the phenomenon, comes to light for the one who encounters it. And so in asking how the I is given, Heidegger is asking how the answer is disclosed to us in a certain mode of being. And Heidegger's answer is that the who of Dasein is disclosed first and foremost in the everydayness of being in the world, and more precisely in our being with others who disclose to us who we are. As such, answering the question, who is Dasein, requires a consideration of Dasein's being with others in its everyday averageness within the surrounding world. We have already considered how Dasein is involved in that world through its heedful circumspection and taking care of things that are ready to hand, as well as how the relevance of those things comes from worldliness or worldhood, which is interpreted as the referential totality of significance. However, an integral dimension of this situation has not been explicitly thematized yet. This referential totality of significance inextricably involves relevant others who are taken into account as part of our involvement with interworldly things. Take, for instance, a computer program. It's designed by a software engineer and designed in such a way with others in mind, ensuring that the program is user-friendly. The position of control buttons and steering wheels of a vehicle are placed in such a position to take into account the others that will drive this vehicle. These others encountered in the context of useful things in the surrounding world at hand are an intrinsic dimension of that context. Heidegger then asks an important question that I'll put in my own words. Are we not creating the problem of other minds by somehow moving from some isolated subject to its connection with others? In other words, our analysis has begun with individual Dasein in its surrounding world, and only upon analyzing that situation did we discover other Daseins. Such a situation would then set up the problem of how do we know anything of these other Daseins, since they seem to emerge after having already established individual Dasein. The problem of other minds is an epistemological question concerning how I can know others have minds, given that I only observe their behaviors. Beginning with such a question, I only have recourse to somehow inferring that they have a mind like mine, but without any certainty that such is the case. This, of course, opens the door to solipsism, in which one comes to believe that only one's own mind exists. Heidegger is having none of this, and it's one of the reasons he's fairly critical of the concept of empathy in this section. Empathy was a concept deployed by Husserl to refer to the phenomenon of feeling or thinking one's way into another's consciousness or subjectivity. In Ideas 1, Husserl attempts to dispel any concern for solipsism by positing the notion of an intersubjective world. Yet that world then, in turn, puts into question the transcendental foundation Husserl was seeking to establish for phenomenology. Heidegger seeks to avoid these difficulties altogether by arguing that other Daseins are not, for the most part, separate from me, but are necessarily part of my being in the world. My world is always already a shared world, making it a with world, and my being in the world as a being with others. Consequently, I don't start out as an isolated subject peering through the epistemological darkness, stretching out in the hopes of grasping another mind like mine. Rather, being with is an existential a priori determinative of Dasein, even when we are factically alone. For being alone is simply a deficient mode of being with. What do I mean by this? I mean one can only encounter aloneness contingent upon a more primordial relatedness to others. With aloneness, something is missing and not added onto my experience of the world. Also, being with has nothing to do with physical proximity, and being alone can and often does occur in the context of physical proximity. Perhaps if you're someone who spends a lot of time reading and thinking about philosophy, you might be able to especially relate to this description. You spend years nuancing and deepening your thoughts, questioning long and widely held assumptions, only to find yourself having to temporarily bracket all that just to engage in mundane conversations and small talk. It's at those moments like that we can experience the greatest aloneness when we are with others. There are other deficient modes of being with that Heidegger mentions, such as being against, being without one another, passing one another by, and not mattering to one another. In this case, others are encountered in the mode of indifference. This distinction between deficient and non-deficient modes of being with parallels what we've already said of the phenomenon of care with regards to our circumspect dealings with interworldly things. However, Heidegger uses two different terms to describe this care. When it comes to interworldly things, we operate in the mode of taking care. But when involving others as being with, it's in the mode of concern. To understand the difference, it may help to look at the two major translations of being in time. The more recent translation, and the one I'm primarily relying on for the series, translates Sorge as care, Besorgen as taking care, and Fürsorgen as concern. Now, the older translation, by contrast, translates the terms as following: care, concern, and solicitude, respectively. The difference in translation can be confusing, especially with regards to the use of the word concern. A footnote in the older translation speaks to the difficulties of translating Versorgen, stating that there's no good English equivalent. The translators elaborate that Versorge is the kind of taking care one finds in the sense of prenatal care, or the taking care of children, or even the care administered by welfare agencies. This is in contrast to the sense of personal care or personal concern of one's own affairs. Heidegger adds that Versorge is used in the sense of taking care of food, clothing, and the nursing of the sick body. In general, I'll stick with the translation of concern rather than solicitude in speaking of Versorge, while Besorgen will remain translated as taking care rather than concern. The deficient modes of concern in our being with others will be the focus of the next video. For the last part of this video, I'll address two possible positive modes of concern. First, there is what Heidegger calls leaping in. In this mode of concern, Dasein intervenes on behalf of another, taking on their burdens for them, standing in for them. Here I take care of what is ordinarily taken care of by the other, substituting myself for them for a period of time until they can once again resume the taking care of those things. However, while doing someone's job for them, one also comes to dominate them, according to Heidegger. By this, I believe Heidegger means that we assume a certain power over them, not only in taking their role away from them, but perhaps also in initiating a debt that the other now owes me. Here I'm thinking of Aristotle's virtue of magnanimity that he discusses in the Nicomachean Ethics. The magnanimous person always seeks to ensure their rightful superior position of honor through their generosity. They're not willing to receive or ask for help, but are always ready to help others. And this finds a more recent expression in the problematic of the gift that we see discussed in certain anthropological analyses, like by Marcel Mauss, and philosophical analyses, such as we see in Jacques Derrida. And it goes something like this: a gift, for it to be a gift, is to be given freely and without expectation of receiving something in return. However, in practice, gift-giving confers a certain status upon the giver over the receiver that places them in debt. You can perhaps think about when you've received a gift from someone that was unexpected, or when offering to pay for another's dinner, or buying someone a drink. It all perhaps unintentionally establishes a certain power dynamic over the other. And it may be something like that that Heidegger has in mind when speaking of this mode of concern called leaping in. A second, positive mode of concern Heidegger calls leaping ahead. Here, Dasein cares for the existence of others in their existential potentiality of being. The central difference between leaping in and leaping ahead is that while the former takes care of things on behalf of another, for the latter, Dasein takes care of others in helping to free them in such a way that they may then take care of things themselves. Perhaps we might liken this to teaching someone to fish rather than giving them a fish. To conclude, being with others belongs essentially to the being of Dasein. As being with, Dasein is essentially for the sake of others. These others are not arrived at after establishing individual Dasein, but are always already disclosed in our primordial being with, and thus always lies within our understanding of the being of Dasein as such. Together with inner-worldly things in the surrounding world, these others form an integral dimension of worldliness. Our knowing ourselves is grounded in this prior situatedness of our being in the world and being with others. In the next video, we'll return to Chapter 4 to address the deficient mode of concern in our everyday being with one another. I'd like to thank the following for supporting this channel on Patreon. You can become a supporter of this channel as well by clicking on the link below in the description. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.